Well, welcome everyone to this very special occasion. Apologise for you being so squeezed. 2 days ago we had 54, last night we had 63, this morning we had 65, and I think we've got 72. So. Anyway, we're a bit squeezed, but so much. And a particular welcome to those people who are Bokel people overseas, because as you can see, we are recording this so that it can go on YouTube, so that our friends from all around the world will be able to view this special occasion. And it's always good to have a second job. Phil's our cameraman over there, ex-Woodside geophysicist. Always a good job, always good to have a second job, isn't it, Phil? Yeah. For those who can't read from where you're sitting, or don't recognise me without a big bushy black beard from the 70s, my name is Don Poynton, and I will be your MC for what that may mean. And this afternoon we are gathered here for what I see as probably three main reasons. The first, of course, is it's a reunion. It's an opportunity to continue those friendships from the past, and I suspect in some cases probably renew things which we have missed out on the past decades. Secondly, of course, today is exactly the 50th anniversary when the first oil was recovered on the northwest shelf, offshore northwest shelf. Yeah. So I thought I'd give you a little presentation. On that day, Henry VIII, posing as Bill Whitley. Bill at that stage was still with Halliburton, was in charge of the testing out on Legendre #1. And this is the test report, DST number 2. Number 1 was in the water leg, number 2. Now, I haven't got my glasses on, but I think they should say something about they opened the tool at 5:24 in the morning and reverse circulated out about an hour and a half later, and they recovered 12 barrels of high gravity green oil, but as you will see, not unusual. So it was time to do it all over again on the same day. So 50 years ago plus about 6 hours, they opened the tool. Marvellous to get oil and gas to surface within 50 minutes. Of course, those days you couldn't flare overnight, so the well was closed in, and then the next morning they recorded that flow rate of 1,014 barrels. So, first oil to surface 50 years ago today. And of course, the third reason we are here is to launch this marvellous, such well-researched book by Andrew Thompson. Andrew has spent many hours interviewing people who were involved not only with the Legendre discovery, but also those people who were with Burma from the onset, from 1962 through to 1976. And we'll hear more about that later on. And at this stage I would like to acknowledge that we do have some current Woodside people amongst us. Lupo, Ruth, Guerrera, we'll get that practiced by now. We've got Ruth, Sully, and did Mark turn up? No? Okay, trunk line's not here. And I'm sure Andrew will have more to say about the Woodside people a little later on. And we should acknowledge the next chairman of Woodside, Michael Chaney and Agu, will be doing an introduction to or launching the book in a little while. We did have this all set out for 54 people with 6 tables of 9, and we had a header table at each table, and these people were 6 people who I think were very significant in the story we're going to hear today. So what we've done is still place them around 2 on each table. I'd just like to go through, because these are rather special people, as everyone is. We've all worked either as staff members, as consultants, contractors, or the very important roles of spouse and partners through those days of Burma and Woodside Burma. But these 6 people I've just picked out. Mick Lombardo, sitting up in the corner. Mick, put your hand up. Now, it was Mick who in 1964, along with, I think, John Abernethy is sitting there close by, took 24 tons of dynamite on their little vessel, Legendre, all the way from Fremantle to Darwin for the very first seismic survey on the northwest shelf, and they survived. Must have been scary. And then that survey was shot all the way from Darwin to Barrow Island. It was the first survey. So, Robert met Bob Armstrong, who joined Burma in Sydney in 1965, and who drafted the maps prepared by Dave McDonald and Lockie McLean over the Legendre structure. Bob. Stan Stroud, who joined in 1967 and after much trouble managed to anchor the Glomar Tasman over the drilling location. Bob. Mike Smith, who in 1968 it was Mike who smelled Texas tea in the mud tanks, and then at 3 o'clock phoned Norm Martison, a very irate Norm Martison I believe, to ask if he could cut the core, which was wasn't the first core cut on Legendre, because in those days it was a subsidised well, but I guess it was the first one to actually see hydrocarbons. So, thanks Mike. Now, somebody you may not all be familiar with, Agu Kanstsler, who 30 years later picked up the reins as the Woodside Exploration Manager and then took the next phase of exploration through to development, which ended up with a 45,000 barrel a day oil field. Well done. And finally, of course, Andrew Thompson, who has been in contact, as I said, with many people in the Burma story over the which, as I said, goes through from 1962 to 1976. Those people were in Australia, Canada, England, and of course Dave Powell in Panama. So I hope to get an opportunity to share. Yes, sorry, Andrew, if you in case you don't have. So over the next couple of hours, I hope you get an opportunity to talk to these people and to hear their first-hand stories. I just thought there were 6 people who did play an important part. So I think, well, no, we've got a few apologies. And these are just alphabetical. Alan Chapman, Bob Duke, Peter Ellery, Juan Fletcher, Bob King, Doug Langton, who you may not know. Doug was a well-site geologist on the Legendre one. Vinod Rajput sends his regards from Sydney. And from overseas, the 2 people who I correspond with and keep track of all the people around the world who work for Burma, Alistair Woodrow in England and Tim Ponson in Canada. Both sorry they couldn't be here, but they will get an opportunity to share the YouTube and spread the word around so they're all localised and we'll get an opportunity to do that in the future. Order up, talk up, and if time permits, look up, because you might see yourself on this screen in a few minutes. All these figures will be from Andrew's book. Thank you. See you in about 30 minutes. In a moment I'll invite Michael Chaney to launch Andrew's book. But before I do, I just want to mention that I did mention we had a number of apologies, but in addition there are 3 other people who sent extended messages, and I'd just like to read those out. Firstly, from Dave McDonald. Now, Dave was hired in 1965 as Burma's first staff geologist, and as we all know, he worked his way through the ranks to become the General Manager of Exploration and Production for Woodside Burma. And Dave and Jean now live in Vancouver, as you probably know. So Dave has written, "Hello Andrew and all. First of all, Andrew, I want to congratulate you again for putting together this great piece of work. Certainly we who lived through those times will feel the excitement and relive the memories coming out of this book. Next, hello to all Vocal people who made it all happen. Looking back, what a privilege we had in taking part in the 2 decades when Burma and the joint ventures had all these accomplishments. And to speak of Legendre itself, I think it would be safe to say there is no other few square miles of the joint venture's permits on the shelf that attracted more intensive study by our geophysicists and geologists.
Personally, I spent countless hours back in 1965 and 66 trying to make sense of the structure, and I had the advantage of working with a super geologist, Bob Erickson. And who would care to estimate how many hours of our great friend Lockie McLean and his team would have spent on solving the structure? Anyone care to estimate how many people worked on Legendre? And maybe we'll hear a bit more from Margaret later on. The Glomar Tasman was a great little drilling machine, but its capability was 300 feet of water. And it was the Legendre discovery that kept the possibility of bigger discoveries alive until we could drill in deeper water. Then we hired the ocean digger, and we could drill Anomaly A that we had been contemplating all those years, and of course the rest is history. For those who don't know Anomaly A, of course that is the North Rankin structure. I really wish I could be with you all today to share a glass and talk about old times. Enjoy yourselves, and once again many thanks to Andrew for recording our story and its significance. I have another message, and this one is from Reg Thomas. Many of you will know Reg, and I see Molly and Helen up there. Now, Reg was Burma's first operations manager. He joined in 1967, about halfway through the drilling of Golden Beach number 1 in the Gippsland Basin. He then went on to be the operations manager for the first tranche of wells drilled on the Northwest Shelf. And as probably most of us knew Reg, not in those earlier days, but later on when he returned to Woodside Burma as the general manager of planning and development of the Northwest Shelf gas projects. Reg is now 91, still in reasonable health, and he and Dawn live in Adelaide. And Reg has written, and he was probably the one who felt this the most: "Thank you for the preview of your book, Andrew. It was quite rejuvenating to read of the work we had all did together in that very significant period in the history of Australian oil industry. I gained great pleasure from having memories awakened when encountering names I had forgotten and being able to recall incidents we shared together. Naturally, I was most interested in the technical and budgetary aspects of the work, but I found quite fascinating your writings concerning the many legal challenges of dealing with governments and partners. As Deputy MD under Lofting and Harry Joint, I was aware of and participated in the trials and tribulations of you and your associates in these dealings. I recall Mike Kelly's frustration with the intransigence of the partners in dealing with operating agreements in which some wanted the operator, viz. us, to assume full liability for any drilling mishaps, and him quoting his mad tool pusher as an example of force majeure. Ah, exciting days. Thank you for this wonderful book. It's a tour de force. Good luck to all vocalites who were part of this great adventure, and please stress to all those past associates my disappointment that I am unable to share the celebrations and the depth of my apologies for missing out on this launch. God bless you all, Reg Thomas." And I'll be very pleased to pass on Reg's regards to any of you want to personally see me afterwards. And thirdly, the man who was in charge of Woodside during most of the Legendre field life, although not there for the actual commissioning, Don Poynton. G'day mates. I understand I'm missing another gala, and as we all know, nobody knows how to party like good folks from Oz. First, I hope each of you and your loved ones are doing well, that each of you are healthy and happy. Second, I want to acknowledge this wonderful occasion to launch this excellent book by Andrew, and also to tip my hat to all the wonderful folks involved with the discovery and production of Legendre. I said 10 years ago that you were the legends, and I mean it more than ever. The rest of us that followed you had it way too easy compared to the trials and tribulations you all went through. I salute you. So even though I'm half a world away, I often think of the fantastic folks that I met and worked with in Oz, and silently smile knowing those were some of the best days of my life. Health and happiness to all. Your friend, one-time CEO, Don Poynton. And now that I've whetted your appetite, I'd like to invite Mike to officially launch Andrew's book, Legendre, Legends and Legacies.
Thanks, Don. Can I start by inviting Elizabeth and Margaret to eat my fish and chips? I think I'm going to struggle to get back there. Secondly, to thank Don Poynton for everything he does over the years, and he's done over the years, as our unofficial historian. To get us all together and things like this. And this, I think, is the biggest reunion that we've had, Don. It's just fabulous. And great credit to you, because I know how much enormous effort goes in behind the scenes to getting something like this together. And Stan Stroud as well, you and your wife, for organising things like the name tags and so on. Terrific. I was really touched, I must say, when Andrew Thompson asked me to write the foreword for his book, and very honoured to have the privilege of launching it here today. This is a quite marvellous book. It describes the evolution of the oil industry, oil and gas industry here on the Northwest Shelf, and the evolution and development of Woodside as from a very small listed Australian company to the largest independent oil and gas listed company in Australia today. But where it's different to some of the other histories of the development of the Northwest Shelf is in its focus on the Burma Oil Company and its role in the development, and in particular on the people that were involved in those years at the end of the 60s and into the 70s, people that most of us here know. It's clear when you read this book that Andrew has done an incredible amount of research. Research by reading things. I mean, for example, he had to read well completion reports, and the thought of a lawyer reading a well completion report, I must say, filled me with delight. He had to learn what porosity was and what permeability was, and being stuck down the hole and so on. So he did a huge amount of research and reading, and he interviewed people, as Don said earlier, in Australia and all over the world. And it's just fabulous that he's been able to put this book together. It's a great source book for students of history about how all of this came about, and it's also for those of us here who were involved, that's almost everyone in the room, a fantastic walk down memory lane, being reintroduced to the people who are involved and the events that happened and so on. It really is fabulous. Now, the book, however, is not, of course, called The Development of the Petroleum Industry of the Northwest Shelf. It's called Legendre, Legends and Legacies. Now, the Legendre well, as we all know, struck oil and flowed oil 50 years ago today. But the casual observer might say, why would anyone write a book about a pretty insignificant oil field? An oil field that only had ultimately about 40 million barrels recoverable, that was totally uneconomic when it was discovered, and wasn't developed until over 30 years later, when the oil price had gone up tenfold and Woodside developed it. And Agu, I think, is going to tell us a bit more about that later on. Anyone who made that comment would be ignorant of the significance of Legendre in the development of the industry in Western Australia and its contribution to Australia. I've always been fascinated by randomness, how a chance event changes the course of history for a company or a country and so on, or at a personal level, how a chance meeting changes the course of your life. And when I read this book, what really struck me was that point, that chance events, in this case the drilling of Legendre 1, gave rise to a history that we now know about that would have been quite different if this well hadn't been drilled. Andrew starts by describing how Woodside, Legendre NL, a really small company on the stock exchange, was granted a huge concession on the Northwest Shelf in this, one of the most remote places in the world, and set about, because it didn't have its own resources, set about attracting partners, and it managed to attract Burma Oil Company as the operator of the venture, and eventually other majors came on board, somewhat reluctantly in some cases. And Burma at that point was a pretty fantastic company. It was the first company to discover oil in what was then Persia. It was the first company to discover oil in the North Sea. And so it came on board and with its partners set about with a seismic program and so on the Northwest Shelf in the early mid-60s. And by 1967 they were ready to start drilling wells. And over the next 3 years, the partners drilled 10 wells, of which 9 were dry holes. Luckily, the second well, after Ashnell Reef, the first one, the second well was Legendre number 1. And it provided the impetus to keep going. It proved that there was source rock and reservoir and structure, and that there could be economically viable oil and gas fields on the Northwest Shelf. Imagine what would have happened if Legendre number 1 was the 10th well on the list. I think there's a big chance that after a couple of years of spending huge amounts of money on wells, and given the difficulties of remoteness, no infrastructure, no transport, difficulty of finding out even where you were in the middle of the ocean, hard seabeds where you couldn't anchor and so on, I think there's a big chance that having drilled 7 or 8 dry holes over a couple of years, the partners would have walked away. They would have said there are greener pastures in other parts of the world, this is another one of those barren sedimentary basins. And Burma may well have said, we're out of here, we're off doing something else somewhere else in the world. Now, eventually, of course, someone would have come back, would have developed, made the discoveries on the Rankine Trend and so on. But how different life would have been if that had occurred, if Legendre 1 hadn't been developed. Jeff Donaldson, the chairman of Woodside, which never had any money, was able to say to the shareholders, this next well is going to be another Legendre, but a heck of a lot bigger. So it might have been Madeline or Dampier, turned out to be dry holes, but he kept raising money just before they entered the primary objective and kept going. In the absence of this discovery, everything would have been different. West Australia would not now have Woodside as a major oil and gas company situated here in Perth. We wouldn't have had the same schedule of development, and the Australian economy would have been much worse off. On the personal level, all of our lives would have been different. If what I've just described had occurred and Burma had shut down and moved the people it brought out here back overseas, people like me wouldn't have been recruited at the end of 1971, 72, and many of my friends here in this room the same. We would have gone off working for other companies, we would have had totally different lives. Our families would have been different, our children would have been different children, because, let's face it, they were conceived under certain conditions in those subsequent years. And so, when I think about it, and the implications of that, you know, you only live life once, and you only get one first job out of university, and for many of us here, this was our first job with Bocal. What a fantastic experience it was. And I've often thought, you know, I wonder if everyone who goes into their first job has a similarly wonderful experience that we had. And I suspect not. All the people I work with, and I'm sure it's the same for all of you, have become lifelong friends. We don't catch up that often, thanks to Don and others, we do occasionally, but when we do, it's just like old times. All of us who joined the company then found out what it was to be a great boss, what it was to be a great manager, because we had people like Dave McDonald and Richard Grayson and Dave Powell and Lindsay Franklin and so on, who are absolutely fantastic people. People like George Edmonds, who's with us here today. And I think I learned a huge amount, as I'm sure you all did, from people like that. Speaking of George, I also learned that people can have two characters. There's the one in the office, which is embracing and inclusive, highly skilled and professional and gentle, until you went sailing and Captain Bligh seemed to emerge. If you wanted a different sailing experience, of course, you could go with Derek Evans, which was whack on, whack off, and run aground. There's a huge number of characters that all of us, I'm sure, can never forget. People like Lockie McLean, who taught us about dedication to the task, attention to detail, passion for the job, and so on. R.J. Gelb was my first well site geologist supervisor. He taught me about punctuation. The geologist would remember and send a description from the rig. Sandstone, semicolon, light olive grey, comma. Porosity, 20%. Calcite, 15%, etc., etc. And you get a rap over the knuckles if that semicolon wasn't in the right place. We had Mike Smith taking over from R.J. Gelb. Taught me everything I know. We had Ian Nucky, who, as Ed Copson told me once, wears Japanese safety boots on the rig. The drilling supervisor in thongs in the drilling shed. Very different to today. And we had character after character, really fantastic people that all of us, some of us sadly no longer with us, but all of them who we have very fond memories of. And then there's one other person, of course, who worked for the company then, who we thought was just a lawyer. A very competent lawyer at that, but turns out to be a great author. And Andrew has produced, as I said, a really wonderful volume here that all of you will enjoy reading in detail. He's gone to an extraordinary amount of work doing this. I don't know what he's going to do next. He may well find that his wife might find that he's, as the Japanese say, retired husband like wet leaf. Very hard to sweep out of the house. But Andrew, we're indebted to you. This is terrific for us to have, and we salute you and your achievement. Thanks very much. Yeah, and I was going to say that actually, Don. And so I have great pleasure, Andrew, in officially launching your book, Legendre, Legends and Legacies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for those very kind words. And I might say that one way to produce a book in expedited time is to have a realistic deadline that one has to work to. And the fact of this 50th anniversary being today was really the spur that kept me going to make sure that we got there on time, and gosh, we did. So I'm relieved and thrilled that we made it on time, in time to celebrate this 50th anniversary of the first discovery of oil on the Northwest Shelf. Michael, thank you very much for your fantastic foreword. I was told as a young aspiring author that when one approaches a fairly busy and heavily committed chairman like Mike Chaney, you should kind of gently suggest an outline to his foreword, or indeed in some cases you ghostwrite them for them. But Michael, in true form to his professionalism, says, show me the whole manuscript first. He read it thoroughly and then did his own excellent draft, in my view, of a foreword which captures the story so well, Michael, and does exactly what it's intended to do. It piques the interest of the reader and hopefully encourages you to keep turning the pages. He does, however, have that history of being a geologist, and he does revert to type occasionally. And as he was reviewing the manuscript, he raised quite a few, I'll call them geoscientific queries, and I think it was sent to test the limitations of me as a lawyer to see if I could answer them. But very fortunately I was able to handball them to Don, and Don could get the right answer back and keep Michael satisfied. So Mike, thank you very much for that forward, and thank you very much for the launch. Look, an enormous number of people have contributed to the stories in this book. There are obviously the ex-Burma oil people and the Bhokal people who were actually involved with the events leading up to the Legendre discovery and the events subsequent to that. And Don has mentioned them, Bob Armstrong, Stan Stroud, Mike Smith, Mick Lombardo and others. So I think we are indebted to them for being able to recreate, if you like, the feeling of 50 years ago with their presence here today. And so thank you guys for being here with us on this celebration. As has been mentioned, I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunity to chat with a lot of people around other parts of the world, in Vancouver and London and Calgary, who were involved also at that time, and they have been very generous with their recollections and thoughts. Some of the ex-employees are no longer with us, but very fortunately their spouses are, and some like Judy McLean and also Christine Grayson are with us today, and they have also been generous in giving me information and photos about their husband's involvement in this event. Some of the contributors sent snippets. Some of them went further and wrote mini epistles and essays, and that was very heartening, and some very unselfishly, I think, shared with us some of their memoirs, which we need to watch out for in the coming days or months. One of those was Dave Agostini's wonderful piece where, I don't know whether it's published yet, Dave, but it'll be a bestseller, I'm sure. And Dave allowed me to incorporate a large part of his private memoirs about an era which was what we refer to as the dark days of the 1975s, when Rex Connor and Gough Whitlam were in charge of our national energy and oil and gas policy, and it basically shut down the industry and shut down the enthusiasm and effort on the Northwest Shelf as well. But Dave's story is all about taking the Glomar Tasman as a package on excursions around New Zealand, the Philippines, to act as a contract drilling operator and working out the remaining contracted wells under the contract with the Glomar Tasman. But most importantly, serving as a technique to keep intact the accumulated skill set that had been assembled under the umbrella of Bhokal. I think I would also like to mention the fact that we've got so many women here today, which is, I think, tremendous, and I don't want to overlook the very significant and pioneering role that some of them played. Way back in 1981, Marjorie Apthorpe, who is with us today. Nice to see you here, Marjorie. Thanks for joining us from Sydney. Marjorie and Judy Garstone were the first women offshore on the Northwest Shelf, and the boys had run into a bit of trouble drilling North Rankin 6, and they had lost track of exactly the sands that they were in. And so Marjorie was sent out very urgently at short notice to sort out the problem with her micropaleontological skills. And that was quite hard to spell in the book, Marjorie, but hopefully I've got it right. But the point of the story was that Marjorie managed to work out where the boys were in the hole, and to tell them to keep drilling, and then 11 metres later they discovered their pay zone. And so Marjorie, we're indebted to you, and also for setting that historic step of being the first woman to work offshore. Perhaps if I could be permitted an indulgence, my sister-in-law Jane is here today, and Jane also claims a first. Jane, back in 1966, was the first in-house female lawyer working for Whoppet, and it's great to see Jane here, but also Jane's contribution was fantastic in helping me through the tenure situation way back in 1966-67 on the Northwest Shelf, and particularly what Whoppet and its then competitor Woodside was doing. Look, there are lots of wonderful anecdotes and stories in the book, and time doesn't permit me to go through them all, but I just want to draw your attention to a few when you get a chance to read the book. Have a look at the story, which has nothing to do with Legendre. It's all to do with the two Smiths on board the Burma Oil Ocean Prince rig in the North Sea in 1967, which was getting hammered by 80-knot winds, and actually started to break up. And it's a fantastic story, which again time doesn't permit me to go through the whole detail, but it's a classic sitcom of the tale of the two Smiths and mistaken identity. And maybe Mike Smith might have a little bit of time later to tell you about it, but he was one of those Smiths. And
they should do a film.
We should do a film on it. Look, the other one that I think is a bit of a standout is the one that Stan Stroud told me. Stan is one of the all-time record Woodside employees. Stan started with Legendre, encountering all those problems of anchoring and having to design a system of drilling in piles in a circle to hold the anchors in place. And then going into some private practice for a while, but coming back and working for Woodside. In the interval, the Legendre field had been developed, but it had been sold over to Apache, and was ready to be decommissioned, and had been decommissioned. And he was chatting one day with one of the Apache engineers, who said quite proudly, "Oh yes, I was involved in the decommissioning of the Legendre oil field." And Stan said, "Yeah, yes, well tell me more." He said, "Well look, it's the craziest thing that I've ever encountered. We did some sonar scans and we came across these ring of 7 piles drilled into the seabed. Well, not only was that unusual and strange, but they had presented a terrible obstacle because they had fishing nets and cables all tangled through to them, and it made the decommissioning extra difficult. And I can tell you, Stan, whoever the idiot was that drilled those bloody piles in was absolutely out of his mind." And Stan said, "I was the idiot." Look, there are many more stories, so I think I just want to say thank you for to all those that took some time to contribute their recollections. Look, there are a couple of other thank yous. I've dedicated the book, obviously, to all the people that were involved in the significant discovery of Legendre, as Michael has outlined, and the events that followed. But there are 2 other people that I've mentioned in the book and in the dedication who were very important to me in different places at different times. The first is Michael West, who took a leap of faith in 1971 when he employed me in London as a junior concessions lawyer in their international exploration department, and I was very fortunate to secure that role. And then Michael had a close association with Australia because he had been involved way back in 1967 in doing the concessions work in Australia to convert that massive permit 213H into 9 of the transitional new permits. He also was very instrumental at a later stage in actually selling out Burma's interest in Australia, and he has some stories that he relates in the book about that experience. The second is Dave McDonald, of course, who I think all of you know of or do know. Dave similarly was very good to me when I returned to Australia and worked for Bocal in Perth, and took time out with a lot, as he did with a lot of other young aspiring people in the oil and gas industry, to show them the ropes and introduce them to his contacts. So both are wonderful exemplars, I think, of tremendous standards of behaviour in the oil and gas industry, and it's certainly a pleasure to dedicate the book to them. I want to thank a few other people quickly. First of all, Peter Purcell. Where's Pete? Peter Purcell, Stan Stroud and Peter Ellery. Those three guys took a lot of time out of their busy days in reviewing manuscripts of the book and drafts, and also making some very helpful suggestions, in some cases corrections, and in the case of Peter giving me a bit of a mini lesson in the geography of the North West Shelf, which was wonderful, Peter, and thank you very much for your interest in the project. Finally, I have been assisted enormously through this task by Don Poynton. Don has provided information, materials, leads, contacts, a copy of Tom Corley's book about the history of the Burma Oil Company, access to well completion reports. He's acted as my geological technical advisor, and he's been a reviewer of multiple drafts of this book. I want to say thank you, Don, for all of that time and effort and interest you've shown. It's been fantastic working with you, and I'm most appreciative. Thank you. Now, Michael's already mentioned that Don, I think, should be acknowledged just one more time for the fantastic organisational effort and interest that he shows and has shown over so many years to get all these ex-Bocal people together for reunions, and particularly, Don, when I revisited some of the detail, the effort that you, Tim Ponton, and Ian Whiteley went to organise in 2011 those reunions to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the 1971 gas discoveries. And so thank you, Don, for your continued interest and keeping us connected.
And can I add, Don, how much I appreciate the deal you managed to get the CapS to do. $15 for lunch, and I see it's normally $60.
Hard negotiations, wasn't it, Don? Look, I'm almost at the close, but I want to just draw your attention to one of the quotes in the book, namely the one from Woodside's CEO, then CEO Don Volti, who commented on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Rankin gas discoveries that each of you are the legends of Woodside and we are the custodians of your legacy. And true to that statement, Woodside has stepped up to the plate and generously supported the production and publication of this book. And that support has enabled a limited number of complimentary copies to be made available to the ex-Bocal people and contributors to the book, both here and overseas. So before you leave, and if you are ex-Bocal and or a contributor to the book, we have an autographed copy for you to personally take home, and with our compliments, and the compliments of Woodside. Woodside also, their support has meant that we have been able to offer at subsidised cost the book to some of the ex-Bocal people who weren't able to be with us today, and to the ex-Woodside personnel who worked during the period that's covered by the book from 1963 to 76. And details of all of that are on the flyer. Most importantly, I think for the historic record, Woodside's support has enabled this book to be sent to and lodged with various cultural and historical institutions in Western Australia, obviously the State Library of Western Australia, the National Library of Australia, and it has also enabled us to be able to present copies to their key joint venture partners and main domestic and overseas customers, and some of the industry and professional associations. Now, Woodside's represented here today by their Chief Reservoir Engineer, Lupo Guerrera. And Lupo, I was wondering if you'd be kind enough to come forward. Lupo, it's with our pleasure that we'd like to present this book to you, representing Woodside, with our thanks and appreciation, not only for the support in getting this together, but also for helping us over the years maintain the camaraderie of the early predecessor operator to Woodside, and with our grateful thanks.
Thank you.
Now, Lupo, I'm going to ask you just to hold and stay there for the moment, because there is one more presentation I would like to make. Lupo, we will also be providing you with copies to present to your chair, Richard Goyder, to your Managing Director and CEO, Peter Coleman, and also to your Vice President of Corporate Affairs, Sandra McInnes, who was very supportive of this project when we first approached her. But if you could stay for the moment, because there's one other very important presentation that I want to make. One evening when I was writing about the conditions aboard the 116-metre long Glomar Tasman, I had before me Stan Stroud's notes describing the drilling crew's sleeping quarters. It was dormitory style, with tiered bunks on port side, no partitions, no privacy, starboard side, open showers, open toilets, and this was crammed up into a forward triangle right next to the chain locker. And of course, at night and throughout the whole day, 24 hours, the chains would rattle and rattle and rattle as the Glomar Tasman would heave and permanently adjust its chains, etc. And I was interrupted with a phone call, a mobile phone call, not unusual, crystal clear. Oh, hello, this is Michael Smith. I'm Mike Smith's son. Look, I thought I'd just give you a call because I've been talking to my father about a book that you've been writing. And I said, oh yeah, where are you calling from, Michael? He said, oh look, I'm calling from the Shell Prelude floating platform. The Shell Prelude floating platform is 2,000 kilometres north of north of Perth, and about 200 kilometres north of Broome. And Michael had just finished his shift and had, on this occasion, walked past the golf driving range as he was going to his double berth cabin. He took his shower, and he was trying to decide whether to watch the Grand Prix on Foxtel, or was it going to be a Netflix movie on the other 25 channels that he had available to him. And I said, gosh, things have changed, Michael. He said, yeah, no, it's not too bad. Look, we've got plenty of room on board here. And I worked it out in my head. The Prelude platform is 4 times longer than the Glomar Tasman. It measures around about 3.6 hectares in area, or in old language, about 8 acres. It is the largest floating structure on the planet. And I just thought about his father all those years ago. And so Mike Smith Sr., could you come forward and make a little presentation of a memento about those days?
Well, everybody that knows me knows I can't shut up. And it's wonderful what Andrew has done with this book. But there's another side to this book which will never, never be printed. Now, what I'm here for is to tell you the story of the Texas tea hat. And what I'll do, I'll just read what I've written for Woodside, the story of the Texas tea hat. 1964, in a land far, far away. Now, this is the days when telephones were connected by cables to the wall. You couldn't walk around with them. And people used things called fountain pens. But 1964, I commenced my petroleum career as a well site geologist onshore Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Crude oil was called Texas tea. And oil field workers were called worms, weevils, depending on their time working in the patch. I was a worm. Later, I worked offshore Libya in the Waha and Jano production fields, where you lived and breathed the smell of crude oil day and night. And this would prove so important later on. Offshore Libya, I worked on the Glomar 5, which was a sister ship of the Glomar Tasman that drilled Legendre No. 1. And the Glomar 5 was drilling in 97 feet of water when the drill bit encountered a pocket of high pressure gas, and the well blew out. Now, high pressure gas gushing from the seabed in 97 feet of water, we had a buoyancy problem on the ship, and actually the decks of the ship were awash with the water due to the bubbles reducing the buoyancy of the ship. Time to leave. We were evacuated very, very carefully because no helicopter or workboat exhaust were allowed in that gas pocket. And the story of the evacuation was very good because it trained me for the later problems that I caused to the Ocean Prince when it broke up in the North Sea. With nothing to do, one day we're on shore in Tripoli, and we're in the market, walking through the Arab souk, as it was called. And there's a little man sitting cross-legged, tap, 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 producing hat. Oh, and he was tapping away on a copper bowl. And we thought, hey, there's a great idea. What are we doing to our hard hats? Now, these hard hats, if you notice, they have the global marine symbol of the G with the, whatever that animal is sitting on it, some marine animal, and that was it. So for the princely sum of £1 Libyan pound, which is about 50 cents Australian, I was the proud owner of an embroidered, as I call it, embroidered hat. It came to Australia with us, and I was wearing it on Legendre No. 1. I'd been for coffee, there were signs of gas and so forth, and I was walking back at 11 o'clock after a cup of coffee, and there it was, Texas tea. Now this hat then is a memento of that moment when I smelled Texas tea and the hat was with me, and this is the memento which started the adventure of the Northwest Shelf. Now what I want to do, with the state of Libya that it is now, I'm sure you can't get these done anymore, and it has all sorts of hunting scenes and rape and pillage and various things all around the edge, and of course they don't make these sort of hats anymore, and in fact it was eventually banned on the rig because it wasn't safe because of the weather. So sir, with the greatest of pleasure and the memories of all those great times, I would like to give you the Texas tea hat. hard hat. And this month, every 50 years we have a special, and this month's special is a cleaning cloth that you get. You can get the juices to clean. Thank you very much.
Look, on behalf of Woodside, I gratefully accept the memento of a very special part of our company and our state's petroleum history. While I can't claim to have the same longevity of association with Legendre that many of the people in the room have, I'm very proud to have been a part of its production history. As the reservoir engineer for Legendre from 1997 to 2001, I was actually able to see it from a time where it was an uneconomic oil discovery through to the benefits of 3D seismic and horizontal drilling, an economic discovery. And I was able to bring that forward to the joint venture boards and to the regulators to get all the necessary approvals to make it a production field. So from WA1P to WA20L, the Legendre field came online. And after 9 years, 45 million barrels, and at one time 10% of Australia's crude oil production, it's quite a legacy. So I'm very thrilled, very proud to have been a part of it, very thrilled to see that its early history has been documented. Thank you once again on behalf of Woodside.
Okay, I just want to wrap this up, say a few more words before people do head off, as we're nearing the end of the event. I thought it might be interesting to, we've heard the problems we had actually getting on location and then drilling and then being an uneconomic development, but I thought seeing the man who then picked up the cudgel is with us, Agu Kanstsler. He might just give us a couple of words on how they actually managed to unlock the code and get it off the ground. You can just talk there.
Yep. Thanks, Don. Look, it is an interesting story, and I'd just like to say a couple of things about exploration. The first one is that if you're an explorer, the hardest part of your job is finding the right piece of dirt to go and explore. And Woodside, I have to say, did a tremendous job back in the early 60s by basically taking half of the Northwest Shelf to explore. That gave them plenty of opportunity. But having said that, it's equally a huge problem to zero in on which bits of that are likely to deliver. And I think the company did very, very well to, with the techniques available at the time, zero in on the areas that were likely to prove productive fairly quickly. Similarly, the best place to explore is where oil and gas have already been found. So in that sense, my job and the job of the team I had at the time was made a lot easier by being able to zero in on the Legendre location fairly easily. Before I move on, and just to show you what a small world it is, I've got a share in 2 sailing boats, one of which is here in Perth and one of which is in the Med. But one of my partners in the sailing boat here in Perth is actually the son-in-law of Dave Powell. So there you go. The other one is that I saw on the photos that were coming up an image of Rex Connor. And he was a bit of a demon back in the day. But back in those days I was a postgraduate student, and I would drive taxis to keep myself alive, sometimes in Sydney and sometimes in Wollongong, if I went back to Wollongong on the weekends. And every so often, if I was in Wollongong, there used to be an old hotel called the Illawarra. It was about 100 yards down the road from Rex Connor's office. And he was a huge man. Not fat, but just a big, big man. And I remember the cab I had at the time was an old E.H. Holden. And he would sort of curl himself up into the front seat and he'd drift across to my side, so I was kind of leaning up against the window trying to drive him home to Mangaton. And the car would just sag. And when he got out, you could see it go up about 3 feet. Anyhow, that's a different story. getting on to Legendre, when I arrived at Woodside from a period of being the exploration manager for Shell in Indonesia, it was middle of 1995, and the Titan appraisal well of the old Legendre discovery had just been drilled, and I remember working with the team on a bit of a post-mortem as to why this well had failed, and it was pretty obvious. If you just fold, you know, the old way of doing seismic interpretation, you kept folding the seismic over, you could eventually see whether you had the requisite number of loops or whether the sequence had grown or whatever. But it turned out that one way or another, the team at the time had gotten themselves one loop deep, which meant they had a bigger closure, and they drilled inside that bigger closure and failed to find the oil. But recognising that this was a small and possibly not commercial discovery, I didn't want to plough ahead and drill another dry hole. If you're an exploration manager drilling a dry appraisal well, you drill too many of them, it's a short half-life. So we wanted to do better, and where I'd been working previously in the North Sea, 3D seismic was quite common, and we would use it for exploration all the time, but in Australia that was unheard of. Investing that much money in exploration 3D was just total anathema to the industry. And we also had a recalcitrant partner, whose name I won't mention, but I'll leave you to work it out yourself. And the idea that, and these guys knew the JOA backwards and forwards. I mean, they would have their lawyer, they'd show up with all the relevant clauses underlined, and they knew that if the other parties wanted to go ahead and they refused, given that it wasn't in the approved work program budget for the year, they would get the data for free. And recognising I only had a budget of 25 million back in those days to do a whole lot of exploration, I was buggered if I was going to give those guys $1 million free ride. So we're thinking about how do we get this data, this 3D data, without those guys paying. And we decided that we'd go for speculative 3D seismic. We already had Spec 2D in Australia at the time. And there was a seismic company that was really interested in doing this, called PGS. We got together and we said, yep, let's go and do a Spec 3D seismic survey. So we went to get the permit, and then we realised that the legislation in Australia didn't contemplate 3D, so you couldn't do it. We thought, oh damn. So we hot-footed down to Canberra to get the legislation changed. In a period of about 3 months, we'd rewritten it, we'd circulated it to all the states, and we were just about ready to go. We had opposition from a couple of parties. One, the company that didn't want to participate, who wanted to extract seismic lines every 100 metres so they really wouldn't have to pay for the data, and we kiboshed that. And then of course some of the small companies around town really didn't want to contemplate the prospect of buying a workstation on which to interpret 3D seismic. So, but we got past those problems without too much more of an issue, except that the Friday night before the new legislation was going to go to Parliament, the feds pulled the pin, said they weren't going to run it. I remember being absolutely livid because I'd spent 3 months of long days getting this organised. And anyhow, I took the advice of several people, didn't write anything, didn't say anything, went home, started on Sunday at lunchtime, finished a 7-page missive to the feds about midnight on Sunday, which obviously arrived in Canberra at 3 o'clock in the morning. I get a phone call at 7 o'clock our time to sort of say, we see that this arrived on our email system at 3 o'clock in the morning, you must be serious, we're going to run it. So, the 3D seismic was acquired, the recalcitrant partner didn't get to see the data because it was spec, you have to buy it, and we then proceeded to put up a well called Jobert, because we wanted this to count as an exploration commitment, and with the nod and a wink, the state government would allow us to do that, and off we went. Not before, however, working very closely with Lupo to get the volumes right, and working closely with a bunch of really good development engineers to come up with a low-cost development concept, realistic numbers where we could demonstrate that this project was economic. And that was the thing that we were trying to make sure that if we did this, that the thing would pay out. As it turned out, Jobert was a success. The 3D showed us that there were 2 separate structures. which was good because I think those of you who can remember, you got a bonus for finding another field. There was a tax incentive for doing that, so keeping the two separate was good. The 3D allowed us to prove that. The 3D also allowed us to fast track the development. It probably advanced the development time by about 18 months, and that increased the NPV of the project quite considerably, and we could drill with a fair degree of certainty. And Lupo over there was working with us. He put together a development plan which survived scrutiny, survived the partner scrutiny, and they're both low-cost operators, and it was a great piece of work by Woodside, who were typically big development guys at the time. So to do something cheap and cheerful like that was a tribute to the can-do attitude of everybody involved. The upshot was the field came on in 2000 or 2001, 2001, and it came on just at a time when the oil price had been in the doldrums but was rising quite quickly, and it actually made a mozza for the company. It paid out in 9 months, and peak production was 45,000 barrels a day. So really, really good shot in the arm for the company. Laminaria Corallina had just come on at the time, so those of you who were shareholders back then probably remember some fairly good dividends starting to flow through. The problem, however, is that success for an explorer breeds the next problem, which is how do you replace reserves and grow? And at the time, gas was worth nothing, so we really had to go out and find oil, and then we went down to the Exmouth South sub-basin and found a lot more. But building on what the original explorers had created, between the middle of '95 and 2010, the exploration teams in Woodside went on to discover about another 20 trillion cubic feet of oil and gas equivalent, or 3 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent gross, which was pretty good, recognising that at that stage it was already getting to be reasonably well picked over. But as a student, postgraduate student, looking at some of the old seismic lines and the fields that have been discovered on that old seismic, I remember thinking this was all black magic, and whatever you guys were drinking, I needed to get some of that. So thank you to all of my predecessors who contributed so mightily to the success of the company and the ultimate realisation, I think, of almost the full potential of the North West Shelf. Thanks, Don.
I'm just going to give our other two special guests a 1 minute chance to speak if they wish to. Mick may have left, hasn't he? No, Mick, do you want to say anything about your 1 minute on anything about the North West Shelf? And then I'll ask Bob if he's got 1 minute.
No, just to thank all the comrades who were here today. Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thanks, Bob. Just 1 minute, Mick, to say anything you want to about your early days to help wrap it up.
Well, we go back to May the 4th, 1964, and I had a very big fishing boat. I think it was the biggest fishing boat, made out of steel, and my father, who had had a stroke, was not fishing, and he was on the wharf, and a guy called Doug Conlon come down, and he was looking for a boat for Western Geophysical, and that's how it all started. I think at the end of the day we finished up with about 1,100 people working for us in different countries, and it was a great journey. The things that happened, and the positioning, the Shoran, the radars, none of the charts, none of the maps were correct. The lighthouse that was there wasn't really there, it was here. That one was over there, that one was over there. What happens 27 mile out of position, and we're shooting in shell territory. Well, the commotion that caused, and a million stories, and it's just wonderful, and I enjoy reading it every day when they have a discovery or whatever they do. I just wish Woodside well. Been good to me. And Dave McDonald was especially good, George Edmonds, all those good people that worked for Woodside throughout the years. Thank you.
Thanks, Mick. And maybe we give the last word, in quotes, the idiot, but I think we recognise that Stan is actually the man who's probably spent the longest time at Woodside, almost 50 years. between the time he joined as a junior engineer through to consulting and finishing up back at Woodside. And Stan, I'll give you the last say.
Thanks, Don. Today started with reference to Mick Lombardo shifting dynamite from Darwin down to offshore Dampier. And you can say that pretty quickly, but that's like shifting dynamite on a boat from Melbourne to halfway between Brisbane and Townsville. Unless you've been up there, you've got no idea how remote and how distant and the distances involved. And there was no one up there in those days to help you if things went wrong. The first well we drilled was Ashmore Reef. It was spudded in October 1967, probably about 7 or 8 months before Legendre number 1 was spudded. And with that well, it was positioned using radist, and the only maps we had were those that had been done by Matthew Flinders. And I don't know why they sent that guy all the way from England out to off northwest Australia. He was a terrible mariner. He had Ashmore Reef 4 nautical miles out. He didn't know what he was doing. I want to acknowledge a few people here today, like Bob Armstrong and Mike Smith, who I've done a lot of work with back in those old days. And I want to talk about my first encounter with Mike Smith.
Which might be the second, Stan.
I was sent, that's right, after drilling Ashmore Reef, I came back to Perth, and our boss was a chap called Lofting, who would be the hardest boss or person that you could ever imagine. I mean, when you worked for Lofting, it was 7 days a week, and if you were lucky, you'd have Sunday afternoon off, and if that was the case, it was a barbecue at his place Sunday afternoon. But other than that, it's like this is the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the Meckering earthquake, which occurred on a public holiday. So if you worked for Burma back in those days and you were in Perth, you were in the office. So I was in the office. My wife was over in South Perth, and we had a lovely flat on the first floor overlooking the water across to the city. And the earthquake came, and I remember Pat Meehan, who was a materials man, he raced in and he said, what do I do, what do I do? I said, get under the desk. Anyway, the side of the building opened up like this and then it closed again. It did that a couple of times. So that was okay. So when I got home that night, I said to Jan, what happened over here? Did you feel the earthquake? She said, feel it. Anyway, the door to our flat opened and there was a stairway, and opposite there was another door. Anyway, there was a young girl in there, and she was asleep, completely nude. And she woke up in a panic. The earthquake woke her up in a panic. She rushed out, down the stairs in the nude, and a gentleman had a coat. He gave her the coat. Anyway, the moral of the story is, don't work on public holidays. Now, getting to Mike Smith, I was out on the rig, and I think Clive Tyner, who was the senior petroleum engineer, the way we used to run the rigs, you'd have 2 Burma people out there, a drilling supervisor and a petroleum engineer. And that was all, and everyone else was contract. So I was out there, and we used to work a week up there and then a week in the office. It was either Dougie Langford or Clive Tyner pulled the pin. So we were 1 man short. So Lofting rang me up and he said if it was Clive Tyner, he said, this was over the radio. We didn't have telephones out there in those days. The technology didn't exist. So he said, Tyner's gone back to Ireland. You'll have to stay out there until we can hire someone. So anyway, it was just my luck that there was a guy in the UK who happened to be on the Ocean Prince, and a big storm came. It was relatively shallow water, so the 2 main pontoons were sitting on the seabed, and as the storm came through, the wave orbital velocities created these currents, and it undermined one of the pontoons. And so with every wave, one pontoon would go up and down, and the other one was sitting on the seabed, up and down, up and down. Well, of course, the rig broke up. So they flicked Mike over to Australia. I don't know how long we were in Perth for, probably only hours. That's what happened to me when I arrived here.
Oh, it was tough, Stan.
It was tough, yeah. But anyway, DC-3, it was all DC-3 planes back in those days. So Mike would have flown up on a DC-3 and then out to the rig, and he said, I'm your relief. And I said, well, here's the handover notes. Nice meeting you, pal. And I was off. I don't know. I can't remember if I was up there. Was it 3 or 4 weeks that time? 6. Okay. Yeah, so it was tough back in those days. I think that's about all I want to say. Otherwise, none of that is in the book that Andrew has written. I read about 3/4 of that book when it was in draft form, and I really can't wait to read the rest of it and read about Mick Lombardo's operations and things like that. But it is a fantastic book. It's about history, and I really take my hat off to Andrew for putting the time in. I don't know how much time it took him, but when you read it, it's a lot of time, Andrew, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, I'll finish there and thank you very much, Don.
Okay, so we're just about ready to wrap it up. Just like to thank you all again for coming along and really making this, I think, so successful. Now, if you haven't signed the attendance book, please do so before you leave. And if you do change your email address, I'd really appreciate you dropping me a line so I can keep in contact. We'll let you know when Phil has finished editing and has got the filming of today's event up on the YouTube. You can be able to view that again. Bokel people and those who contributed, don't forget to pick up your books. And I have one last request, and that is put in your diaries for next year, the next reunion. And the easiest way of remembering it, this is what we've done in the past. The first Tuesday of the month is always the Melbourne Cup. The second Tuesday of November is always the Bokel reunion. Travel home safely.